Thank you, Bill. And we're going to jump right into this because a year ago, in this time of year, we met and talked about the fact that 8 senators and your congressional representative, Representative Kristi Noem, made a request to the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Administration asking for an investigation into your sheep industry to determine specifically if the meat packers were manipulating the marketplace. So you had 8 senators and 1 representative make a formal request for an investigation into the markets. And on December 20th, just days before Christmas, the USDA released their investigative report, which was all of 14 pages long, and the outcome was very disappointing. In fact, the entire report, this is my opinion, the entire report is unsophisticated, it is deficient, and like all of the GIPSA reports before it, it is a clear example of how the administration, through the GIPSA, is really an apologist for the packers. Now, with that very biased opinion, I want to start and give you an interpretation which I believe is quite factual of what they found in the report. So to begin with, the investigation was called for because there was an anomaly in the pricing of lambs. We saw lamb prices increase through 2010, midway through 2011, and then suddenly they started to fall, and they fell all the way through 2012. So the senators and the representative asked whether or not there was manipulation going on in the marketplace, and they also asked GIPSA to look at the cutout to live spread to determine if the increase in the spread between the live sheep prices and the cutout prices was indicative of market manipulation by the packers. And so in their request, they made some specific allegations. One, they wanted to know if the packers manipulated the on-the-shelf lamb supplies to drive down prices for live sheep producers. They wanted to know if the packers manipulated the price of lambs by packer feeding, by owning their own lambs and feeding their own lambs. They wanted to know if the packers were manipulating or restricting access to the marketplace for independent producers by killing their captive supply lambs first, leaving the producers having to wait until their lambs exceeded the optimal weight before they could have access to the marketplace. They also, the senators and representatives, wanted to know, are there structural problems in the lamb market that are inherently causing problems in the market, anti-competitive problems, and they wanted to know what potential impact was the livestock risk protection program having on the lamb industry. That's what the congressional members asked for. This is what GIPSA decided to do. They decided to look at 3 areas. They wanted to look at the sharp increase and subsequent decrease in lamb prices for the period January 1 of 2010 through the end of 2012. They also wanted to look at the commitment procurement of slaughter lambs to the packers during this same 3-year period, and they wanted to look at whether the risk management agency-sponsored insurance policy for lambs enabled the packers to manipulate the prices. So even though there were numerous requests by members of Congress, the Packers and Stockyards Administration focused on 3 areas. And here's the graph that they provide in their report. This depicts what they viewed as a problem. The red represents the carcass value of lambs. The blue is the dress formula value. The green is the cutout value. The black is the cutout to lamb price spread. Okay. So in the January 1 of 2010, the prices began to increase all the way up through July of 2011. They peaked in July of 2011. You saw carcass prices begin to decline. You saw the dressed formula prices declining, and you saw the cutout price declining. For the live to cutout spread, this is the packer margin. We saw that the packer margin was at about $50 at the beginning of this period. When prices peaked in July of 2011, the packer margin fell to $8 a hundredweight. When the prices of lamb started to decline after mid-year in 2011, the packer margins began to increase and ended the year at $90 a head. what did I say? $8 a hundredweight before, $8 a head to $90. No, I was right the first time, I'm sorry. It's per hundredweight. So what we had here, and this is what Gypsum looked at, was what were the possible causes of prices to increase from 2010, reach a peak, and then suddenly decline for this long period, as well as what were the causes of the packer margin to decline to this $8 figure and then suddenly jump up to $90 while lamb prices were actually declining. And here was the scope of their investigation. GIPSA interviewed 45 people: producers, dealers, livestock auction managers, packers, market analysts, and federal regulators. Nowhere in here did they interview retailers. They also reviewed the records of 3 lamb packers. They looked at the records of Superior Farms, of Mountain States Lamb Cooperative, and of JBS, all of these down in the Colorado vicinity. And they looked at the actual reporting, the price reporting conducted by Agricultural Marketing Service, also regarding this livestock risk management program and the Livestock Information Center. So that's where they obtained the information to conduct their study. So what did they find? First, what they found in the sheep industry is that the top 4 firms in the sheep industry controlled approximately 68% of the entire sheep market. That's, from our view, that's a lot of concentration in the marketplace. To put it in perspective, the top 4 meat packers in the beef industry control about 85% of the steer and heifer slaughter. So you've got a 68% control of the market held by just 4 firms. The measurement in antitrust is called the HHI index. An HHI index determines horizontally how many firms in an industry and what level of competition exists as a result of that number of firms. They have a number equivalent to determine whether you have unconcentrated markets, moderately concentrated markets, or highly concentrated markets. A highly concentrated market starts at a figure of 2,500 and goes up. What USDA found was that the sheep industry had a HHI index of about 1,700, which was a moderately concentrated marketplace. But here's the problem, and here's why I think this report is biased. Number one, even the Justice Department recognizes that this economic index to measure concentration in a marketplace was designed for retail markets, for a manufacturer that's selling a product to retailers, so it's that retail side of the equation they're looking at. But what we're talking about here is buying power. It's the opposite direction. It's suppliers to the manufacturer and how concentrated that manufacturer is to be able to impart or exact market power along the supply chain is very different than a retailer selling to consumers. And so we think that the analysis of using the HHI is really irrelevant in a buyer's side concentration issue like we're dealing with here. But the other interesting finding that USDA made was that of the approximately 2 million lambs slaughtered at federal inspected slaughter facilities in the United States, about 1 million lambs was sold outside of that federal slaughter. Approximately 1 million lambs were sold to the non-traditional markets. These are the ethnic markets. These are the markets where the lamb producer sells directly to the consumer. That's a lot of lamb. 1/3 of the lambs, approximately, was sold to these non-traditional markets. The other interesting factor about the non-traditional markets is they typically want a lighter weight lamb. They want to slaughter these lambs at 90 pounds versus the national average for the commercial federally inspected market is 149 pounds per lamb for slaughter. So they said this was a factor, or this was one of their findings. The other thing they found was that in your sheep lamb market, 26% of the lambs are still sold in the cash market. That's your price discovery market. So in 2010, 11, and 12, approximately a quarter of all lambs were still sold in this cash market. 47% were sold through formula contracts and forward contracts and other marketing arrangements. That was in 2010, 11, and 12. But that's in sharp contrast to where our sheep industry was just a few years ago. Remember when GIPSA commissioned what was called the Livestock Meat Marketing Study? In 2007, that study found that 52%, over half the lambs, were being sold in the cash market, the price discovery market, and about 44% were sold through the formula contracts and the forward contracts. Now, all of these other marketing agreements still use that cash market as a base price. So what we've seen is a 1/2 reduction in the volume of the market that discovers the price for the entire industry, and this is what USDA found during that 3-year period. The other thing interesting was that back in 2007, GIPSA found that only 4.7% of the lambs, less than 5% of the lambs, were actually fed and owned by the packers. The rest of them were either in the cash market or the alternative marketing arrangements. They don't say in this report what the level of packer-owned lambs were in 2010 through 12. But we'll talk about that later because that becomes significant. The other issue, or the other finding of GIPSA, was that they found that the most common pricing method, no longer 52% of the cash market, now we're only 26. So today, the most common method of pricing is the dressed formula lamb contracts. And so they decided that these dressed formula lamb prices were more representative of the sheep industry than was the cash market. Remember though, the cash market is yet the price discovery market, and these formula lamb prices are tied to that price discovery market. So if the market becomes too thin, and if the packers are able to manipulate it simply by avoiding it, they have the ability to depress prices for the entire industry, and yet USDA just assumes this is the better value pricing to use for this entire 3-year study. Other findings of GIPSA. They found that your sheep industry shrunk 90% since 1942, from 54 million head total inventories of lambs and sheep to 5.3 million today. Remember, the lamb crop was about 3 million head sold annually, 2 million slaughtered in federally inspected plants, approximately 1 million sold through these non-traditional markets where the producer sells directly to the consumer. What they determined as the causes of this contraction of your sheep industry was, number one, changing preferences for meats by consumers. Number two, the improved efficiency of meat production in the poultry industry, in the pork industry, and presumably in the beef industry. And low-cost imports. Low-cost imports were a factor in the contraction of the sheep industry. Anybody disagree with that? Obviously, there's been tremendous import pressure on your industry. And low-cost fibers that compete with wool. These were GIPSA's findings for why your industry has been contracting. And there's some huge gaping holes in this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is a deficient list, an insufficient list to explain what has happened to your industry. But we'll go on to some more findings. They found that the increasing price spreads, remember that chart that showed that from the middle of 2011, the live to cutout value went from $8 to $90 during that period to the end of 2012? They said that's not evidence of manipulation. The fact that the packers were extracting more from the marketplace, even while lamb prices were falling, their margin was increasing. They said that's not evidence of manipulation. They said, in fact, that does not even represent packer profits. Because they said all that difference represents is the spread between live lamb prices and the cutout value of lambs. It does not include the packer costs. Well, we know that. But we also know it represents their margin. And from that margin, their costs are extracted and profit is determined. But we think that that subtle statement within this report indicates to us that they're trying to defend the packers' position without doing a thorough and probing analysis of what practices the packers were engaged in to actually facilitate this wide price swing we experienced. The other thing they said was the packers were also harmed by this price swing based on their storage. Now here's their argument. They said that the packers had lamb and mutton in storage while prices were increasing for your lambs. So they had low-cost meat in storage, and when they started to sell that meat as lamb prices increased and retail prices increased, they were actually making a pretty good margin because they were selling the meat in a high market, yet they paid a lower price for these lambs. But then, after January or July of 2011, when the price of lamb started to fall, now the packers had storage of these higher priced lambs, yet the price was falling, the retail price was falling, and so they were actually losing money on what they had in storage because they paid more for the lambs when they put it in storage, and now the price had fallen towards the end of 2012 and they were losing money. Again, we think there was very little foundation for this, and no one talked to the retailers to determine, well, was it true that the consumers started running away from the sheep counter because prices were too high? They just took the word of the packers within the study. The other thing they said was the upturn. The reason the lamb prices increased in the first place, the reason primarily was because of the global lamb shortage in the international market. And we're going to address that as well in a little bit here too. But they said that the factors causing this price swing, the price at 2010 doubled by July of 2011 and then fell back to I'm in trouble now, fell back to a level lower, we're good, at the end of 2012. So you had a huge price spike in the industry. And here's what they said caused that swing. This is different than the contraction of your industry. Now they're talking about what caused the swing in prices. The seasonability in the lamb market. The fact that Easter and Christmas were the two high volume markets for the lamb industry. The availability of imported lamb. Now they're not talking about the low cost imports. Now they're simply talking about the availability of imports and the widespread drought in the United States, among others. We think, again, this list is deficient to explain this tremendous, unprecedented price swing in your industry. So here's a chart that comes right out of the report. This time the red line is your 3 market average feeder lamb price, and the blue line represents the draft formula price for fed lamb. So here we start in 2010, and we see there's a worldwide shortage. Australia has a drought. Early in the year, in September actually, New Zealand had a huge storm, wiped out 1 million head of lambs. And so as a result of this global shortage of lamb, they say, lamb prices started to increase. And then you got up into this area where we were about reaching the peak in the middle of 2011. And they said at this time, we had superior, I should have mentioned, as prices were increasing, you had Superior bought out a major lamb processor in Iowa. Superior bought out Iowa lamb. And then 6 months later, they closed the Iowa plant. And so that occurred before prices reached the peak. And then at the very peak, you had import lamb prices actually peaked. At this period, you see that the carcass weight, or the feeder lamb price, leveled out before it hit the peak in July with the dress formula prices. USDA attributes that to consumers beginning to refuse to purchase lambs at the price that the retailers were offering. Again, no retailers interviewed. USDA simply took the word of the packers. And then you had through this period, they said there was lack of winter pasture. Imperial Valley in California decided to harvest their alfalfa instead of running the lambs on them. And so we saw essentially a stagnant price for feeder lambs through this long period. And you began to see then prices start to fall significantly. And down in this area, at the very end of 2012, they attribute a lot of that to the drought in the Midwest. Also up here, they talk about in January of 2011, there was 100,000 more lambs in Colorado feedlots than there were the previous year. In fact, they said the lambs in feedlots were 25% higher than they had been previously. Other findings, they said that the exchange rates would affect the prices of imported lamb, and that, this was interesting, that the prices for your lambs in the United States of America were actually following the price of imported lamb. And I think this is interesting because I think it should be the other way around. But for the fact that you now import more than you produce, and so today it does make sense that the imported price is dictating to what your prices are domestically. And USDA confirms that. They said that with prices for imported lamb, or prices for domestic lamb tended to increase with prices for imported lamb because a buyer could substitute domestic lamb for imported lamb if imported prices got higher. So suddenly your industry has been reversed. Now you are dependent on the imported price of lambs to set your lamb value according to USDA. And they said that prices at the start of 2010, what you received at the start of 2010, the value of the carcass at the time was about $1.89. However, they say that what you were receiving was a near record. And we're going to show you that that's not true. The prices you received in 2010 certainly were not a near record for your industry over time. Now, I want to go back to this issue of exchange rates. When the exchange rate in Australia declines, when their dollar is valued less than the US dollar, that makes their imports cheaper. And we see an increase in imports coming in the United States. Alternatively, when the United States dollar strengthens in relation to the Australian and New Zealand dollar, then we see the imports are somewhat curtailed coming into the US. So the blue line here represents the average import lamb prices from 2010 all the way to the end of 2012. Blue line, imported lamb. Now we had volatility in the exchange rate values, and so we saw import lamb prices rise significantly when our dollar was strengthening. And so in fact, import values were up to like $560 a hundredweight for imported lamb. And the red line represents your domestic lamb prices, the average dress formula prices. This is kind of interesting. This isn't import pressure from cheaper imports. What we saw over this period was the value of the imports was actually higher than domestic prices, primarily due to the changes in exchange rates. And when these import prices were increasing, USDA is arguing it was pulling our domestic price up. When the US dollar weakened relative to the Australian dollar, it made their imports cheaper, and we saw our prices decline. USDA acknowledges that these exchange rates can have an effect, but they don't analyze this, they don't probe this far enough to actually explain what impact it had on you. Now they said, we're talking about that Superior bought out Iowa land. And USDA said that when they embarked on this study, this investigation, that many observers said that they thought that Superior was taking this action in order to gain control over the marketplace. But USDA, in a very elementary manner, said, well, that's not true. Obviously, they can't control the marketplace because they only kept that plant open for 6 months. Well, wait a minute. You've got 4 packers control 68% of the market. Now you have 3 packers controlling 68% of the market. Don't you think that gave Superior tremendous market power? And USDA is saying just the opposite without any explanation. And they went on to say that by the fall of 2010, packers weren't able to purchase enough lambs to fill their customers' orders. And in fact, they said that's why Superior closed the plant. Could they have closed the plant to eliminate competition? That certainly happened in the cattle industry. And they said by Easter, consumers had begun to reject the higher retail prices. Again, this is taking the word for the packers. Other findings. We talked about the fact that in 2011, there are 25% more lambs in the lamb feeding operations in Colorado. 100,000 more lambs in Colorado. They said the reason for this was drought. As a result of the drought, there was less pasture available. Lambs went into these feedlots early. They also said it was Iowa lambs closing. When Superior closed Iowa lambs, all the production in Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota suddenly had to redirect those lambs down into Colorado, primarily some to Chicago, but that's what happened to increase the sheep feeding in Colorado. And the non-traditional market. Again, that's kind of a wild card. These weren't flowing through federally inspected plants, and these are being sold directly to the non-traditional market, but what USDA says is because the price was increasing, there was less demand in this non-traditional market. So rather than those lambs being pulled out at 90-pound weight to be sold in the non-traditional market, they were being held or sent to the feedlots for further feeding. So USDA says that explains why we saw these additional feeders or lambs in the feedlot. So based on the other issue, remember at the beginning, the congressional members wanted to know, were the packers restricting access to the marketplace by feeding their lambs first and making the independents wait? Well, USDA says, no, that's not true. The packers did not do this because they said, they weighed the lambs that were packer fed, and they compared those to the weights of the lambs that were sold as dressed formula priced lambs. And they said the packer lambs weighed as much or more than the formula lambs. Therefore, the packers were withholding their own lambs from the market for just as long as they were holding the producers' lambs from the market. The problem is Congress didn't ask them to compare the lambs that the packer owned to all the other lambs. They wanted to compare the lambs the packer owned to the lambs sold by independent producers, primarily in the cash market. USDA didn't do that. In fact, they essentially compared it to all other captive supplies. And so we think that's a huge deficiency in this report. They also said that the market remained overweight up until October of 2012, when all the 2011 lamb crops were finally worked through the system, and then they said the weights finally began to drop. And they said that the comparison of those carcass weights indicate that the packers were not processing their own lambs first. In other words, they were not manipulating the market, they were not restricting access to the market. Other findings, they said the lamb market is small, largest plants are physically located close to each other, Denver, Greeley, Colorado, and they said that many of the same feeders were all selling to same three packers. So many feeders were selling to all three packers that they reviewed. And here's what I said about the 4.7% packer-owned lambs back in 2007. Here's what they said in this report. With the exception of their own packer-fed lambs, one feeder was the largest supplier for two of the three packers. What does that mean? I think that means two of the three packers had more packer-owned lambs than they acquired from any other source. So, looking backwards, without going all the way back, I said that about 44% of the lambs were sold through these formula contracts. Also in the report, they said that in 2010, 11, and 12, 70% of the lambs were acquired through these formula contracts, forward contracts, and packer-owned lambs. So we think that 4.7% of packer-owned lambs has jumped up now to about 25%. We think in 2010, 11, and 12, what they were saying here is that suddenly the packer-owned lamb volume has now jumped up to 25%. We need to confirm that. That's what we've extracted from this report. They also did an analysis of this livestock risk management program. They essentially said the blue line here was the net indemnity that the federal government paid out. The red line was the number of lambs that were insured. While prices were rising from 2010 to mid-2011, very few lambs were insured. Suddenly in July of 2011, when the prices started to fall, apparently there was a report out in the trade publication that said that the government was running out of money and there may not be any available funding for this. So you had to sign up by October, and so suddenly you saw this huge spike in lambs signing up because the prices were headed downhill, and they were told that there was a likelihood of running out of money, and so the government paid out total over this period $36 million in indemnity payments. I can't say that word right. Versus the $6 million in premiums that were paid. I'm going to skip that. Here's the conclusions. The conclusions in the 14-page report. The increase in prices was primarily caused by an international shortage of lamb. The decrease in prices was caused by drought, seasonality in the lamb market, a decrease in the quantity of lamb demanded due to high prices, overweight lambs resulting in less desirable product, and then other reasons. And then they've also concluded that they did not find packer manipulation with the prices, that lamb packers did not process their own lambs while delaying purchases from others, that the livestock risk protection lamb was not likely a source of price manipulation, that Superior Farms' purchase and closure of the Iowa lamb plant was detrimental to producers in the Midwest. However, the investigation that USDA found was that the reason they closed it was legitimate. They simply could not find a sufficient availability of lambs to keep the plant open. And they said a limited amount of information about rivals production, a part that we skipped. They were able to glean information from the marketplace, even AMS reports, because there are so few packers that when AMS puts out a report and they say the number of lambs slaughtered in a particular area for a particular price, all one of the packers has to do is take themselves out of that number, and they know what the others were gaining. And USDA recognized that and said even though that's the case, they did not find packers manipulated prices. So here is from 1980 to 2013, here's your lamb prices. Remember they said, here's where the start was. 2010, we had this huge spike in lamb prices. These are San Angelo, Texas prices for 140 weight slaughter lambs. And we saw this huge, unprecedented spike in prices that USDA was looking at. But all of this shows that there have been many times when your lamb prices were higher than they were at the beginning of 2010. USDA starts their assumption with the fact that even at 2010, your prices were near record prices, and therefore, why are you complaining that you had this huge increase and then you settled back down into the same region? The volatility here is significant, and I'll talk about that as well. That what we had in this period was unprecedented volatility. So USDA says that your industry experienced corrections in the past, in the 1950s, in 1980s, in 2001, and now in 2010 through 2012, but they recognize that this was the most severe correction of all. Question is, what did it correct? You had a huge price spike, and then you had a decline, and you essentially came right back down to the trend that your industry has been in. Why is this report wrong? Here's what we want to do. We want to write a very thorough letter to USDA complaining about the whitewashed report that they put out to the industry. We think this report is corrupt. And here's why. Number one, this entire study assumes that the industry was competitive leading up to 2010. So all the while that your industry was contracting, all the while that you were losing your market share to imported product, all the while that the meat packers were reducing the price discovery market from 52% to 26%, despite all of that, USDA assumes that we started with a clean slate when they began this investigation. And we certainly didn't. In fact, we contend that the reason we had this volatility was because we ignored our antitrust laws for too long. We allowed these meat packers to gain the market power sufficient to depress prices over the long term, that you have been receiving depressed prices for many, many years, and this was just a symptom of a broken marketplace to experience that much volatility, and in fact, we have evidence to support that. In 2003, economist from Purdue University, John Connor, said that captive supplies have been shown to increase the instability of prices. Captive supplies have been shown to create the volatility that you saw in your industry. We think that's one reason this report is deficient. The other is the report simply does not analyze the impact of these captive supplies. It didn't even do the fundamental analysis that has been done by GIPSA in past investigations. In 2007, for example, they determined that a 10% increase in packer-owned lambs decreases prices to producers by 0.23%. We had increased packer-owned cattle, we believe, lambs, packer-owned lambs, from 5%, less than 5%, to approximately 25%. That certainly should have had a significant impact, a negative impact on prices. USDA ignores it. And why else is this report wrong? No analysis of the regional indexes for this HHI measurement. Not the least of which was the fact that we don't think it's applicable to the buyer side of the equation. The other is when economists look at buyer power in the cattle industry, they look at 9 regional markets, recognizing that there are regional markets in the marketplace for fed livestock. USDA ignores that. USDA assumes that there's no anti-competitive effect of using this dress formula lamb prices as representative of the industry. Now here's something interesting. In the cattle industry, these formula prices have a base price that is typically tied to the cash price. In fact, it's tied to a previous cash price. So for example, a producer will contract with a meat packer to sell their cattle on a formula contract. They'll deliver the cattle in the second week in January. And the price will be determined by the average price the packer paid during the first week in January. So it's a reported price, everyone gets to see it. That's not how the lamb industry works. In the lamb industry, these dressed formula lamb prices are based on the carcass value. The carcass value is on the other side of the production chain. You have the live lamb producer selling to the meat packer. The meat packer converts the lamb to a carcass and sells it to a breaker. And it's that side of the equation that all of these dressed formula lamb prices are based on. And USDA even acknowledges that this is an ultra-thin market because most meat packers fabricate themselves and they don't sell carcasses to another breaker. And so here we have an inherently non-competitive price being used by USDA to analyze this huge price swing in your industry from 2010 to 2012. Also, they didn't analyze why. They explained what happened, that when the cutout to live lamb prices started to increase while lamb prices were falling, the packers received $90 instead of $8. This was a benefit to packers, but they didn't explain why that spread was occurring. Nor did they explain what is a competitive value for a packer margin. Is $8 competitive? What is their cost of production? What were the gross profits or the net profits of the meat packers during this 3-year period? None of this information is included in the report. Also, the causes attributed to the retailers, again, was essentially based on what the packers told them because the retailers were not interviewed. And additional reasons, they did not analyze whether the packers were strategically timing those imported lambs in order to depress your lamb prices over the long term. Not just from 2010 to 2012, but leading up to 2010. And then perhaps these other factors came in much like what happened in the cattle industry. In the cattle industry, in 2002, we were suffering with $67 fed cattle prices. And then in May of 2003, the anomaly struck, BSE was detected in Canada, the border was closed. We only closed off about 3% of the live cattle coming into this country, and our fed cattle market jumped to the highest price in history. Our fed cattle price jumped up over $1 within a 5-month period, increased $26 a hundredweight. Packers, we found out that when the packers could no longer strategically time their imports of beef into the U.S. market, the effect was that the marketplace itself unleashed the competitive forces and producers started receiving a fair value for the livestock. USDA didn't analyze that factor, that important factor. Also, USDA completely ignores the mitigating effects of increased exports that were actually have been at record levels. This is a chart from 1980 to 2012. And the maroon line here represents the volume of lamb and mutton exports each year. The blue line represents the sheep inventory. So this chart showing that sheep inventories were declining while exports were increasing. But look at the last few years. I mean, we've had significant exports of lamb and mutton from the United States during this same, these were absolute records, unprecedented historical records that we were receiving at the same time that USDA says your prices were being depressed because there was too many imports. Well, why weren't these exports mitigating that 100,000 head of cattle in the Colorado feedlots? We had 18 million pounds of exports in 2011. If you figure that at about, well, the difference would be 4 million pound increase. That's got to be about 40,000 head of lambs. 18 million has got to be over 100 head or 100,000 head of lambs, why did USDA only focus on the import side of the equation and completely ignore the mitigating effects that exports should have had on this price volatility? The other is it ignores Superior's increased market share, as we talked about when they closed that market in Iowa, and it did not compare the weight of all the captive supplies, the packer-owned lambs plus the formula lambs, to the cash lambs, to the lambs sold by independent producers in the cash market.